Hello, and welcome to our live stream today with Bill Barker as Thomas Jefferson. Today, we're talking about Jefferson's experiences in the colonial capital city of Philadelphia. Please post your questions for Mr. Jefferson in the comments and let us know where you're watching from.
Well, good afternoon, friends. It all looks so very, very familiar to me. You know, I wish I had been to the very first Continental Congress that was held in Philadelphia, September 1774, but it was not held here. It was held rather at the newly completed Carpenter's Hall building, just about a block or two away. The reason why I wish I had been there was because of what I had written. I was instructed by my cousin, Mr. Peyton Randolph, who was elected the first president of that very first Continental Congress, to draft a summary view of the rights of British North America, that it might be delivered at that very first Congress to bring us all together upon our general causes and concerns. The fact that we had continually been petitioning for redress of grievances and had been denied that essential right of an Englishman. I could not attend. I fell ill. And so I will never forget, though this pamphlet was printed in Williamsburg, Virginia, that would have not happened had not Jupiter Evans taken my draft, my handwritten draft, while I was still at Monticello, and ridden those 5 days on horseback to Williamsburg, Virginia, and there to have it printed by Mrs. Clementina Ryan. It was this pamphlet that was taken up to Philadelphia by Mr. Peyton Randolph and read amongst all of them that were gathered there, that they might reacquaint themselves with our grievances. And you know, my name does not appear on it. It says, by a native and member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. Many asked, who is the author of this summary view? To which my cousin Peyton replied, it is my cousin Thomas Jefferson of Albemarle, Virginia, a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, indeed. They said, please tell Mr. Jefferson he's become well known as an author, even in his absence. It's good to be back in Philadelphia, and welcome to all of you here as I reminisce upon those times that I hope to have felt useful in the concerns of not only Virginia, but all of us, the concerns of Americans that led us to declare our independence. Well, I'm certainly ready for your questions. I'm certain you have many of them. So as you've allowed me here a moment to reflect, I now look forward to your questions.
So, Mr. Jefferson, whenever the month of June comes around, do you reflect upon the months of June during which you were at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia?
I do, and though the Continental Congress met throughout several springs, well, the only two springs that I recall were the spring of 1775 and the spring of 1776. So yes, during those years, June of 75 and June of 76, I remember well being in Philadelphia City, attending to that Second Continental Congress on both occasions. I just reflected upon the First Continental Congress in the autumn of 1774. And one of the consequences of the First Congress was to call for a Second Congress to reconvene the following year. And so it was in the spring of 75 that I rode up to Philadelphia to attend my first, though it was the second. And then many people refer to the Congress meeting in Philadelphia in the spring of 1776 as the extension of the Second Continental Congress, which it was, but it was still that Second Continental Congress that we were all in Philadelphia during that particular June. So 2 Junes that I recall being with our Congress in Philadelphia.
Well, we've had a question come in already from Tara asking, where did you stay when you were in Philadelphia?
Well, Tara, when I first went to Philadelphia, and not many people know this, I was but 23 years old when I went up to Philadelphia in 1766. And I stayed there at a particular home of a, some say he was a relative. I still have never been able to ascertain how we are related, but at the home of Benjamin Randolph. My mother, as you know, was Jane Randolph, daughter of Captain Isham Randolph. This Benjamin Randolph, and sometimes I've even referred to him as Ben Randall, was a cabinet maker in Philadelphia. So it was that 1 month I was in Philadelphia. That was May of 1766. I stayed there. Now then, when I returned to Philadelphia to attend the Second Continental Congress in the spring of 1775, I stayed as well with Ben Randolph at his house. And then the next spring, when I returned in 1776, I stayed with him again up until the latter part of May. And that was when I moved to a newly built brick townhouse. It was on the southwest corner of 7th and High Street. I believe they now refer to High Street as Market Street in Philadelphia. The townhouse was built by a German immigrant, one Jacob Graff, a Graff, a well-accomplished bricklayer. And so I rented 2 rooms on the second story of Mr. Graff's townhouse, a bedchamber and a parlor. The parlor fronted out on High Street. And so that is where I stayed during the remainder of the spring and the summer of 1776.
We have a question about the actual trip from Monticello to Philadelphia. Was it an arduous trip?
Quite arduous. Of course, the first trip that I went up in 1766, I went by water. I simply went to Williamsburg, and there I took a tender out to a ship that was anchored in the York River. That ship then sailed out the mouth of the York River up the Chesapeake Bay. I stayed in Annapolis for some days, and then from Annapolis sailed up to the Chester River, and that was up northeast. I disembarked in Chestertown, followed the road up to Dover, and then up to Philadelphia that way. Now, in the spring of 1775 and in the spring of 1776, I went from Charlottesville up by way of Culpeper, then Culpeper up to Leesburg. Leesburg, I crossed the Potomac, went over to Frederick, Maryland. Frederick, Maryland, I went then up to Hanover, Hanover to York, York to Lancaster, and then I followed the old North Carolina Road. That is what it was called, the North Carolina Road, essentially from Leesburg up to Frederick and beyond. Then I followed that east into Philadelphia. So that was on the average about a 7-day journey on horseback.
So can you tell us about any other times that you visited Philadelphia, either before the Continental Congress or after?
No, I would say that those visits, the first when I was but 23 years old in 1766, the object, of course, was to be inoculated against the smallpox. Oh, yes, there were particular doctors of physic, self-proclaimed, who could endeavor the virilation, particularly in Norfolk. But I think I mentioned this before. They were more successful in killing their patients than to cure them. So if your family had the means, then you could travel up to that center of well-read and accomplished and degreed doctors of physic, and that was in Philadelphia. And so that is where I was inoculated against the smallpox by Dr. Shippen, William Shippen. And so that was the very first trip I mentioned, by way of Annapolis and back. And then the second time, well, I had hoped the second time would be in September 1774, but I was the one who was then ill, not with smallpox, happily. And then that next time, so the second time I went up was in the spring of 1775. So there were many other times that I traveled to Philadelphia. That was after the war. But before the war, and of course, when we think about when the war commenced, for many, that was the spring of 1775, because some of our business in Philadelphia was to draft a reason for taking up arms We also drafted an olive branch petition, even though we were taking up arms to defending ourselves, even though we formed an American army, even though we commissioned the first rank of general to former Colonel George Washington of Virginia. And when I say commissioned the first rank of general, if you were born in the colonies, you could never rise to the rank of general in the British armies. So with that, our business in that spring and summer of the Second Continental Congress, 1775, you might say the war had already begun. And of course, the British newspapers were printing, as we would read them here, the colonies are now officially in a state of rebellion. So you'd already had Lexington and Concord that spring of 75. 2 weeks later, the same action attempted in Williamsburg, Virginia. So the war had already commenced when we returned to the extension of that Second Continental Congress in the spring of 1776. And coincidentally, that Second Continental Congress was one of the longest. That was up about, oh my heavens, it must have been over 530 days. And that continued up into December, though I had left much earlier than that. So once I left that Second Continental Congress, that was in early September 1776, then I did not return to Philadelphia until after the war was over. And remember, too, during that interim, the British actually occupied the city of Philadelphia. I believe that commenced in September 1777 and continued through that fall, through that winter, into the spring of 1778. I think they left in June of 1778, and then Congress did return to Philadelphia after that time. But during the interim, that fall of 1777, winter of 77, 78, and early spring of 78, Congress met in, they met in York and they met in Lancaster, far from Philadelphia, to proceed accordingly with their business. Of course, I have always thought they might not have had much to worry about the British occupation of Philadelphia, though the British accomplished building somewhat of a barricade, you might call it, that is a long, high, wooden fortress-like wall between the Schuylkill River and the Delaware River. It ran somewhat as an arc, a barricade north of Philadelphia. Otherwise, they simply enjoyed themselves in Philadelphia. And who could not enjoy themselves in Philadelphia? There were a lot of dances being held, and in particular, one great dance, one great missionanza. That's what they called it, the missionanza, an extravaganza, if you will, of merriment and dancing, and a whole fleet of decorated British gunboats that sailed up and down the Delaware River. Can you imagine? That's how the British enjoyed their occupation of the city in which we declared our independence.
So can you tell me a little bit about some of the people that you met in Philadelphia?
I had mentioned on my first trip to Philadelphia when I was 23, I made the acquaintance of Dr. William Shippen. He continued to be a good friend of mine. Later on, if you will, when I went up with Bob Hemmings, Bob took me and accompanied me up to Philadelphia in 75 and in 76. He was the son of Bet Hemmings. It was Dr. Shippen who then inoculated Bob Hemmings against the smallpox. I met also in 66 a gentleman who was a renowned teacher of Latin in Philadelphia, and his name was Mr. Charles Thompson. Charles Thompson was later selected as the secretary of the Continental Congress. He was selected as it began in September 74, and he remained through 75, 76. He was the secretary of the Congresses all the way up through 14 Congresses. The first one back in September 74, 14 Congresses up until the spring of 17, it might have been the late autumn of 1788, when we were adopting and ratifying our Constitution of the United States. Can you imagine the experience that Mr. Thompson had through all of those Congresses? He knew each and every one of us very, very well. In fact, he kept somewhat of a journal of the comings and the goings and the friendships and the animosities that existed amongst all of us. And not very long ago, I wondered whether he still had that journal. I wrote him inquiring of the same, and he wrote back, yes, I still do have it. Remarkable that you remember. And I wrote back to him and suggested he burn it. Now, just some things that history does not need to know about the personal proclivities of those who are engaging the business of government for the safety and defense of our nation and our people. Charles Thompson, a delightful individual. He went on to become headmaster of the public grammar school in Philadelphia. That is the public grammar school that was chartered by William Penn. The William Penn Charter School was the office, if you will, of Charles Thompson, former secretary of our Congresses.
Well, you briefly mentioned Bob Hemmings, Robert Hemmings, and we had a question about Robert Hemmings from Bridget that said, can you speak about your enslaved valet, Robert Hemmings, and how he assisted you during your time in Philadelphia?
Oh, Bob, as I have often referred to him, became quite accomplished. In fact, he was not so adept at carriage driving. He was a young boy when he came on to drive me. Before that, I had talked about Jupiter Evans. Jupiter Evans, of course, had driven me back and forth to Williamsburg, or simply accompanied me on horseback to have someone accompany one. And Bob Hemmings certainly did in kind. He couldn't have been more than about 15 years of age. I know he was born in the early 1760s. And mind you, Bridget, he was born at the Forest, the home of my late wife, Mrs. Martha Wales Skelton Jefferson. So when I married, that was January 1772, then Mrs. Jefferson brought quite the dower rights with her to Monticello, where we went to live. And of course, the Hemmings family were one of several families who accompanied the late Mrs. Jefferson to live at Monticello. Later on, Robert accomplished himself in many other efforts that would provide him the opportunity for manumission. He was married. I believe his wife was Dolly. And Dolly lived with a doctor, I believe it was in Fredericksburg, a Dr. Sachs, I believe his name, from the Germanys. And so Bob would go back and forth and visit with Dolly many, many times. Well, after a time, you realized this couldn't continue to their mutual happiness. And so, indeed, I then provided his manumission and his freedom that he could go be with his wife.
We've got a couple of questions here. Tara asked another one. Was Ben Franklin there when you were in Philadelphia? And if so, were you friends?
Well, Tara, I will tell you, when you think of those that I did not meet in my first trip to Philadelphia in 1766, but had the great opportunity and happiness to meet later when I returned almost 10 years later in the spring of 1775, Dr. Franklin was one of them. And I would say another was John Adams. John Adams had attended that First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774. Dr. Franklin was not there. He was still in England, but he returned from his time in England, and good heavens, he was in England upwards of about 17 years. He was pleading our cause during the end of that time. He had attracted the attention of Mr. Wilkes and Mr. Barr, Edmund Burke, but thank heaven he returned to be with us and to be seated in that Second Continental Congress in 1775. We became good friends, and when you heard me just reflect upon Mr. Adams and now Dr. Franklin, imagine the three of us were able to sit together the next year in the spring of 1776 when President Hancock, John Hancock, appointed the three of us to a committee of 5 men to draft our Declaration of American Independence. The other two being Mr. Roger Sherman of Connecticut and Mr. Robert Livingston of New York. But Dr. Franklin was surely our mentor in so many, many ways. His experience was nearly illimitable. And to think that he had been postmaster of the crown of the colonies, had ridden throughout, traveled throughout all of those colonies, and to think he was a newspaper man at the same time, I cannot think of another individual who had as much information and as much experience of all of these former colonies and knew how to get it across in the newspapers to inspire people, and particularly to make people think. Not another individual, to my mind, and the mind of many others, than Dr. Benjamin Franklin.
We have another question asking about your collaborations with George Mason on crafting the Declaration of Independence. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, Colonel Mason was not in Philadelphia during that spring of 1776. But you are not incorrect to suggest that collaborating on our Declaration of American Independence. And the reason I say that is because though I traveled to Philadelphia in the spring of 1776 directly from Monticello, from my home, that spring of 1776, it was occurring in Williamsburg, Virginia, the efforts to create a Virginia Declaration of Rights. And that was foremost under the guise of Colonel George Mason. That Virginia Declaration of Rights, in all of its articles, I think upwards about 13 to 15 articles, certainly pronounced boldly what actually you could say was written here in the Some Review of the Rights of British America, but more specifically pronounced these rights boldly unto the colony of Virginia. And that Declaration of Rights, talking within it, the self-rule and direct representation of Virginians. Although we have to be cautious when we say direct representation, we have to remind ourselves now, even these many years later, those who were properly represented were the white male freeholders, 21 years of age or older, still secure in the part of their freeholdings, not only in land, but also in labor. That it also, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, purported the inalienable right of an individual to hold their opinion upon religion as they should choose. Although a truck that I had with that, because it is said that Colonel Patrick Henry was of influence in that particular article, was that within it, it announced freedom for religion through Christian forbearance. So if you're talking about freedom for all religion, well, perhaps that was pointing to one in preference to many, many others. But the Virginia Declaration of Rights was decidedly an influence for the work of the 5 men on the committee appointed by President Hancock to draft the Declaration of American Independence. By that time, by early June of 1776, we were familiar with the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Some say that the Declaration itself could almost be an entire plagiarism of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. I would not suggest that by any means. They are similar. No one can deny that fact. But I would say what is probably the reason why many would think that is because all of us, and I'm not saying so much in Virginia, but throughout the colonies, we were all thinking the same thing at the same time. We had been for quite a while. Virginia was, well, many Virginians will tell you, the largest, the wealthiest, the most populated. I'm not going to deny at that time, the general population of all of the colonies was about 2.5 million. 2 million, about 500,000 souls. And Virginia probably was upwards of about 550,000. I would recommend. The second largest of the colonies was Pennsylvania. That was followed by Massachusetts. That would be followed then by, North Carolina and Maryland vied one with the other. But the one thing for certain, Philadelphia was the largest city in all of those colonies at the time, upwards of about 40,000 souls. So much larger than even the small little village, you could call it, of Richmond, even smaller Williamsburg at about 2,500 souls. Second to Philadelphia, you might look at New York. I would say New York, maybe 23,000 souls altogether. Then go to Boston, maybe at 15,000 souls. Then, my heavens, you could go to Annapolis, suggesting in Annapolis that there might be, oh no, Charleston. Let's go to Charleston before Annapolis. Charleston, upwards of about 11,000 souls, and then go all the way north to Newport, Rhode Island at about 10,000 souls. So again, this is somewhat extant, though extraneous, you may think, yet very necessary to realize the potency of what everyone had been thinking, particularly in the centers of newspapers and what had been printed in the newspapers, and thereby in Virginia itself, in Williamsburg, to see manifest finally a declaration of the rights, not only of Virginians, but the rights of Englishmen throughout all of the colonies. I beg pardon for the ramble, but I do want to be distinct and clear that our Declaration of American Independence is not word for word an exact copy of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. It was influenced very much by the Virginia Declaration, and I think influenced the thinking of many, many people, not only throughout Virginia, but throughout the former colonies.
Great. Well, thank you. Can we talk a little bit about what impressed you most about Philadelphia? Maybe some of the architecture or whatever you'd like to talk about?
Well, I will never forget my first trip to Philadelphia in 1766. I was absolutely taken with the beauty of the Christ Church. I believe it had been built in the early 1750s. It was said that the Christ Church there, around 2nd and Market Street, right near the waterfront, was completed at about the same time the State House was finished, between 5th and 6th, or 4th, 5th, and 6th on Chestnut Street. The State House, of course, I understand is increasingly becoming known as Independence Hall. Well, they were both completed at the same time, but the beauty, the delicacy of the Christ Church and its remarkable spire. It was the tallest building in all North America. It held many a visitor to that city transfixed. So I would say that was one of the very first places that struck me when I visited Philadelphia. And furthermore, too, the design, the plan of the streets in Philadelphia, not too different from the plan of Williamsburg, Virginia. That is, main avenues and intersecting streets, north, south, east, west. They called them, in terms of the medieval world, bastides. These are planned cities. And as you know, Williamsburg, Virginia, and Annapolis, Maryland, were planned cities. They were both planned and delineated by former Royal Governor Francis Nicholson. But the plans of both of those cities, Annapolis and Williamsburg, are different to fit the contour of the terrain. Annapolis is on various hills, so you have roundabouts on the top of the hills, I think two hills there, and then it's as if spokes are outside of the wheel connecting those roundabouts. Williamsburg, Virginia is a straight plain, more or less. It's the highest elevation between the James River to the south, the York River to the north. So you have the broad Duke of Gloucester Street down the center, east-west, and then you have to the south, of course, Francis Street, to the north, Nicholson Street, running parallel, and they intersected. In Philadelphia, it follows a more broad plan. I believe Thomas Holmes was the surveyor commissioned by William Penn to help design the city of Philadelphia. And that is done on that same 90-degree axis as well. So you have the north-south of that broad street, and then you have intersecting it at 90 degrees, the east-west of the High Street I spoke about earlier, which is now referred to as Market Street. And so then you have the intersecting streets running east-west, running north of that High Street, running south of that High Street. And then on both sides, east and west of the Broad Street, you have the enumerated streets that are running in both directions. So I think that is one of the most fascinating elements of the city of Philadelphia, which allows, if you will, far more efficient commerce to take place. The enumeration, if you will, of houses and shops and various stores and the like are easy to attend with that sort of delineation. So that was striking to me. Now, I will tell you as well that when I was able to return in 1775, a building which had been erected early in the 1770s, and I believe it was about 1770, was the building where that first Continental Congress met. It was the Carpenter's Hall Library that was created through the group of carpenters, the mysteries of carpenters that had got together in their particular trade and put in to create this beautiful cubular feat of architecture. Its beautiful proportion, and whom better to provide that but the carpenters themselves. That main room in the Carpenter's Hall was where the first Congress met in September 1774. But what they so appreciated about the opportunity to use the building is the fact that on the second floor was this wonderful library, most beautiful library, and a ready reference for anything that they might have been arguing and debating during that first Continental Congress. So having the opportunity to return to Philadelphia in the spring of 1775, not having been there for nearly 10 years, I was quite struck with that Carpenter's Hall building. Now, I do not want to estimate the State House there in Philadelphia, where we met in 75 and continued to meet, the Assembly Room, and of course the Supreme Court room across the hall from the Assembly Room there. That is a magnificent structure. In fact, I will tell you that the bell tower and the clock tower itself, though not as high as some people have told me it is now, was most magnificent, and particularly for a clock that was built and placed inside that tower facing west. So you could see as the city was growing westward there towards the Schuylkill River, that many would be able to have the opportunity traveling down Chestnut Street eastward to be able to see that clock. I think it was the Spurk family that accomplished that, or Sprague, Spurk, Thomas and Peter. S-P-U, well, nevertheless, well, that's the short answer.
So I have a question from Christine, and she would like to know if you were involved in the introductions or romances of anyone while in Philadelphia. And she particularly mentions the Madisons and wonders if they might have met there.
Well, that was sometime later, Christine. I could, no, I was not. To an extent, that was in the 90s when I believe our government was being seated there. I'm trying to recall, but I do not recall that being so much at that time. Mr. Madison, James Madison, had just come to Williamsburg. Now, this is the James who received his collegiate enlightenment at the Presbyterian College in Princetown, New Jersey. He arrived in Williamsburg, Virginia, at the time that I was going up to the Second Continental Congress in 76. So it was not during that time, but it was later, as the government continued to convene in Philadelphia, that Mr. Madison was introduced to the Widow Todd at the tavern at Gray's Ferry. This is what I am recalling hearing. I was not there. And he was introduced to the Widow Todd, yes, now I know I was not there, by Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr introduced the two of them. It was at Gray's Ferry Tavern. So how providential in itself that the two of them then became a very, very happy couple. You may know that the Widow Todd's husband, John Todd, the most successful lawyer in Philadelphia, passed away during the yellow fever epidemic. So that proves it was much after. That was, of course, in the late autumn of 1793. And I had left Philadelphia that late autumn and did not return until, of course, I was elected vice president of our nation. So as Mr. Todd passed away, and I believe their young son as well passed away from the yellow fever, the Widow Todd was not a widow so very, very long, as I'm almost certain she had quite the retinue of suitors there, endeavoring to get her hand, but all of them, happily, it was Mr. Madison. You know, as you reflect upon the various taverns in Philadelphia, reflecting upon the Gray's Ferry Tavern, that was a delightful place to convene. But I remember when we were in Philadelphia during that Second Continental Congress, that a Mr. Joseph Clark had a tavern right across Chestnut Street, on the north side of Chestnut Street, from the State House. So most of the delegates would convene there at Mr. Clark's. Then, of course, there was the sign of the Conestoga Wagon. That was down Market Street, a bit of a distance, a couple of blocks from the State House. But many would gather there at the sign of the Conestoga Wagon, and how appropriate too, because so many of those who were coming into Philadelphia from the Germanies to start a new life coming into Philadelphia would then embark from the city of Philadelphia westward along what I had mentioned was the Carolina Road. And they would follow that out west through Pennsylvania, come down the Shenandoah Valley, all the way down to Hillsborough in North Carolina, and farther than that. Then there were many a Rising Sun Tavern. How they get the names, I have no idea, but I know there was one along a great avenue known as Rising Sun in Philadelphia. And of course, that would be on the east side, though the west bank of the Delaware River, where you would see the rising sun come up over New Jersey first. And then who knows, maybe some of those who were in the taverns an overly long time through the evening might not have known anything until they woke up in their same chair and table to the rising sun.
Well, I think we have time for one more question. And this question is from Patty, and she would like to know, what was your favorite memory of your time in Philadelphia?
Patty, you know, I cannot help but think, seeing for the very first time Mr. John Adams, that spring of 1775. And the reason I say that, and I do not wish to ignore seeing Dr. Franklin. I had seen him earlier when I was a young boy as he traveled through the colonies as postmaster of the crown. He was certainly renowned, but so was Mr. Adams. Mr. Adams was renowned because of his defense of the British soldiers as a result of that riot in Boston back in March of 1770. Many refer to it as the Boston Massacre. And the fact that at that trial he made a statement which certainly influenced many of us as we met in Philadelphia to get the facts right, to know that we were secured in our inherent right, not being able to petition for redress of grievances, though we tried, the right to take up arms and defend that right, defend our inalienable right, given to man not by any government, not by any ruler, but by nature and nature's God. And that was Mr. Adams' statement at that trial. Facts are stubborn things. They're stubborn things. They go well beyond the influence of any one individual, any one group of individuals, because they are facts. They have been secured for some time. So I would say that remains a very happy memory. And I'll never forget when he, perhaps more than anyone else, spoke at length as to why we should come together e pluribus unum to create a new nation, that I stood, I was moved to stand up and to applaud his wonderful, wonderful speechifying and elocution. So I look upon that as perhaps most delightful. I look upon later trips that I made to Philadelphia, meeting so many others that have remained lifelong friends, staying at Mrs. House's boarding house, becoming good friends with Elizabeth House of Trist. And here I know I'm going to embark upon many an individual and many a wonderful time that I had yet again in Philadelphia when I returned there as Secretary of State, and then later as our second Vice President of our nation. So perhaps we can save that for another opportunity when we may meet again here in Philadelphia and enjoy all of the marvels that the city continues to offer so many who come here, reflecting upon our past, let alone simply to enjoy fine hospitality and that great sense of freedom of the mind, which the Quakers want to impart upon so many. You know, I cannot forget that it was in Philadelphia that I first bore witness to that inherent right to hold one's opinion upon religion as one should choose. It was the city of churches, freedom for religion, that I saw there first. It offered the very first system of schools to which could be enrolled poor as well as wealthy, and female as well as male. And I was able to speak with individuals, both of the Germanies, let alone Englishmen, who were very concerned about forming together a slave emancipation society. That did not happen when I was initially there, but it did come to pass in Philadelphia. And so I cannot help but think, as we meet again, that we can explore and reflect upon so much for which that city will ever remain renowned.
Thank you very much. And thanks for joining our live stream today with Bill Barker, and we will see you next time.
A pleasure.